the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. My name is Catherine Pappas. I work for Alternatives, an international solidarity organization based in Montreal. Founded in 1994, Alternatives' mission is to contribute to the construction of a world where social justice and rights prevail, whether political, social, cultural, economic, or environmental. On November 3rd, the whole world will hold its breath. The results of the US presidential elections will not only shape American politics for the next years, but will also influence the state of global order and international peace. Over the last few years, we have seen Trump disable democratic institutions, undermine the justice system, time and again abuse presidential power, violate the rights of minority groups and women, use unprecedented military force on protesters, and continue to deepen racial disparities across the United States. In the last few months, moreover, his catastrophic management of COVID-19 has led to over 200,000 deaths, and numbers are still rising. The outcome of these historic elections in the US is of concern to all of us. But the issues that our guests will discuss tonight and in the course of the following 3 webinars are not unique to the United States. The struggle against systemic racism and violence and the empowering message carried by movements such as Black Lives Matter resonates in many countries around the world. The rallying cry against systemic racism and violence that was triggered by George Floyd's tragic death finds echo in France with the killings of Adama Traoré, Lamine Dieng, and Amadou Kaomé, and in Quebec and Canada as well. Let us remember Régis Korchinski-Paquet, André Campbell, Machouar Madout, Nicholas Gibbs, and other Black Aboriginal people and people of color killed by the police. More recently, the tragedy of Joyce Echaquan, an Indigenous woman and mother of 7, and a member of Atikamekw Nation of Manawan, who died in appalling circumstances in a hospital in Joliette, is another example of the racism that many Indigenous people face when accessing health services here in Quebec and in Canada. Still today, systemic racism nurtures, tolerates, and deepens class and racial inequalities. It is undoubtedly the other pandemic. The racial justice movement is not just about the US. It resonates everywhere in the world. Black Lives Matter carries a struggle against a colonial past that hasn't really passed, and a whole system of oppression that needs to be dismantled. The first step, however, is to acknowledge that systemic racism exists in the US and outside. And it is only from this recognition that real and effective steps can be taken to repair and to end it. I would like to thank Global Dialogue and their team for their tremendous support in making possible this series of webinars on the United States that start tonight, as well as our other partners, les Amis du Monde Diplomatique, the Plateforme Altermondialiste, le Comité Altermondialiste de Québec Solidaire, and Europe Solidaire Sans Frontières, as well as my colleagues at Alternatives. Our warmest thanks to our interpreter, Albert Baudry, and to tonight's guests, Duha Elmardi, who will host the session. Duha is a community organizer and former member of Atlas Corps and Global Changemakers, passionate about social transformation through art, education, and advocacy. She currently works as the Education and Engagement Coordinator for Sustainable Concordia. She is also a student in the Community Economic Development Program at Concordia University and is affiliated with the human rights collective, Sudanese Archives. And our guest speaker, Anthony DiMaggio, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Lehigh University. Anthony has written for many progressive media outlets such as Counterpunch, Truthout, ZNet, Z Magazine, Alternet, Common Dreams, and so on. He is the author of 6 books, most recently Rebellion in America, as well as Selling War, Selling Hope, and The Politics of Persuasion. Thank you all for being here tonight. There will be a question period after the presentation. You can use the chat in the Zoom. It should be at the bottom of your screen, or Facebook to send your questions in English or French, and we will communicate them to the facilitator. Enjoy the webinar, and thanks again for being there.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone. Welcome again, and very happy to be here with in conversation with Anthony DiMaggio today. And we have a lot to cover today, so I'm just going to get started. Anthony, did you have something to say?
Well, I just wanted to thank you all for having me. I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about, in a really important moment in American history and the sort of face we're going to put forward to the world very soon.
Absolutely. All right, so we are actually going to start with the most recent of conversations that's happening right now, the events of last week, the October surprise, if you may, if it is a surprise, the fact that President Trump has tested positive for the coronavirus, along with his wife, Melania, his close counselor, Hope Hicks, and several other members of his team, Kayleigh McEnany and Stephen Miller. So this reveals a lot on Trump's negligence and the health of transparency, of information and democracy at this point. Since the beginning of this pandemic, Trump has been doing the opposite of what health professionals have been encouraging Americans to do, wearing masks, keeping a safe social distance between each other, and so on. According to you, Anthony, is it a huge shock that could derail the president's campaign and destroy his chances of re-election on November 3rd? Or do you think he's going to use this to continue downplaying and minimizing the risks of this virus and to discredit the election process that he's afraid he's going to lose? And how does this impact the presidential race?
Well, there's a lot of good questions there. I guess, in terms of shock, I would say the only thing that shocked me was that it took this long for him to get it, with how cavalier he had been with basically flaunting simple medical rules and recommendations. So, with a highly contagious disease, this virus, that was the only shock, really. And so I think, if you look at this actual election, one thing that's been pretty clear is that it's incredible how resilient his supporters have been behind him. Like, he has said himself, I could shoot somebody on, Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any votes. And I don't think he's far off. We live in an era where we hear Donald Trump every day talk about fake news, and I have little doubt that most of his supporters will wish away any negative news as fake news. So that's an important point to bring forward. Having said that, I teach American politics and introductory level, higher level. And so I have to follow this stuff pretty closely with elections. And it's pretty hard to argue that anything that's happened in the last week and a half has helped him. It has hurt him a bit. He's down about maybe 2 points from where he was before. If you look at, the aggregators like 538.com, which look at all the national polls that are being done, he wasn't doing particularly well before, and he's doing worse now. He was maybe at around 7 or 8 points down to Biden before, and now he's down about like 10 points. And there's a lot of these states, if you look at them, it's not very close. Whether you're talking about my home state of Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, these were states that went to Trump in 2016 that look very far out of his range at this point. A lot of the states that, were pretty close or that he was leading in, like Ohio, he's now just a little bit down in. Florida, he's down everywhere. So really, we're sort of at a point now, if you look at this, it doesn't look like, barring any sort of seismic event in the next month, like much is going to change. The fault lines are in place. So what we're really seeing now with the Trump administration is that he's trying in any other way he can to undermine the electoral integrity of the process. So we've heard stories about how he wants to try and convince state legislatures to just hand him all the votes for the Electoral College because, well, voter fraud, whatever that means. I mean, nothing's been documented. And he wants to try and, get the Supreme Court to throw out popular votes in swing states. And he's talking about having these, quote, poll watchers. Well, we already have poll watchers. There are professional people who are brought in to look at American elections. What he's talking about is something worse than vigilantism, because the idea with vigilantism is at least the idea of a vigilante is that they're supposedly righting a wrong, maybe through a bad way if there's an injustice that's been committed, but there's no injustice here. You're talking about people who want to vote and exercise a democratic right. And he's calling on, these alleged poll watchers. What are they really? Something else entirely. That's the fear. that they're going to be harassing people of color and poor people in swing states, in major cities. He called out Philadelphia, in my home state, as a place where voter fraud was rampant, and somebody needs to do something. So these kinds of things go beyond dirty tricks. You're talking about some kind of blatant militant authoritarianism and like quasi-fascistic, neo-fascistic stuff here. And what we notice when we look at Americans is that, you know, the country is extremely divided, but there are large numbers of people increasingly who are just sick and tired of this, especially when he got sick with COVID. 60% of Americans were asked in a Morning Consult poll, and they said that he was wrong to say, don't be afraid of a killer virus like COVID. 2/3 said he didn't take proper precautions, and because of that, he got sick. About 60% of Americans say he's done a bad job of handling the COVID pandemic. So, you know, there's about 40% of the country, maybe about 43% now, that seem to stick with him no matter what. But the other 60% of the population, you know, they range sort of somewhere between disapproval and dislike to active antipathy and anger and hatred. So it's an incredibly divided country. And we seem to be at a point right now where the scales have been tipped pretty significantly against Donald Trump.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this year has been a big year for the United States. The United States is facing the most serious crisis in their recent history. The US right now has about 20% of global death from the coronavirus, with 210,000 people who have died, and more than 7 million people have been infected. And of course, this has, disproportionately devastated Black, Latino, Indigenous, and immigrant communities in the US. So could you tell us about the biggest mistakes of Trump's administration, specifically with dealing with COVID-19, and what differentiates the United States from other countries?
I think it's a good question. I think realistically, as a sane person, we would want to use this language about mistakes. I think the problem that comes up is that we're dealing with a president who's not sane. Donald Trump just last night went on a mad Twitter fest storm talking about fictitious coups against him that were allegedly organized by Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. There's no evidence of this whatsoever, that they tried to have some sort of deep state coup against him, which is the kind of language that he's been using. The evidence that he put forward, there was no evidence. It was like he cited his own campaign website and other random Twitter posters who are conspiracy theorists. And so the problem that comes up here, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, I think a sane person would say, oh, look at these mistakes that the administration has made regarding COVID and regarding other policies, of course, too. But they don't see it that way. They have a mentality of looking at the world. This president is the first open conspiracy theorist president in US history. And there's some kind of mental illness there when you have a president who's talking about on Twitter how his political enemies are criminals who are planning a coup, who need to be thrown in prison without any evidence whatsoever. And so there's this sort of not just paranoia, but extreme viciousness where they have this mentality where this president doesn't see anything that he's done as a mistake. He has said explicitly, I don't take any responsibility. He has a philosophy of the world where it's like every man and child for himself. At least this is rhetorically what he says. And this is the politics that he's put forward. People who have enough resources, they'll take care of themselves in this COVID crisis. But I would even go to the point where, and I don't want this to sound conspiratorial because I think it's all very open what he said. But this is like almost a planned failure. Not a planned failure in the sense that he would say, I want as many people as possible to die. He doesn't say that, but he says in other ways things that make it very clear that this is part of his ideology, where he has abdicated basic leadership. There's this reactionary ideology within the Republican Party that he's made much more extreme, where they celebrate this idea that it's a dog-eat-dog world, it's survival of the fittest style thinking, and if someone's poor or a poor person of color or other disadvantaged groups, that they get what's coming to them. This sort of fake social Darwinianism, fake social Darwinism, whatever you want to call it, that it's not real. Because every second that, any time that a corporation is in trouble, like we've seen with coronavirus, there's instant talks about bailouts and and hundreds of billions of dollars allocated to them. But this president, it's really quite incredible how many Americans just sort of ignore the things that come out of his mouth because they support him as a Republican. So they ignore these damning things that he says. He said when the coronavirus started that I want the governors to take care of this. It's not my responsibility. At best, I'm in a backup role. And he was attacked by governors for this by saying, they said, we don't need a backup quarterback. We need a Tom Brady. And they didn't seem to care. They were more than happy to just put this off. This was just a fundamental abdication of leadership. And this administration had said very clearly before COVID-19 that they basically burned the Obama playbook on dealing with epidemics and outbreaks. They got rid of the CDC funding for fighting global diseases. They disbanded their entire health security response team that was supposed to be devoted to coordinating with other countries to fight global pandemics. He had proposed prior to this crisis that the fiscal year budget for 2020 would have $1.3 billion cut out of it for CDC funding. So they did these things all intentionally. They said, well, we just don't care about these things. They're not our responsibility. And it's not my responsibility to lead in any of this. And then they got a lot of bad press for that. And then they finally sort of stepped forward a little bit, but they didn't really do very much. The whole national stockpile of PPE had been depleted. And they started sort of building it up, and they basically told these states, go do it yourself. And then they instantly undermined that by starting to compete with them over buying PPE. And Trump basically wasn't giving out much because the federal stockpile had been so depleted. And to the extent that he was giving out anything, it was basically based on fealty. He told these governors, if you're not nice to me, I'm not going to give you anything. And there was this weird clientelistic stuff going on there. The administration had this VIP list that it came out where, to the extent that they were bringing companies in to provide PPE to the federal government, it was just people with connections to the Trump administration who were looking to make a quick buck. And so there's this sort of weird cronyism and clientelism. And so this is how this administration operates. They are not concerned with the average person. And, they have this very faux sort of rhetorical social Darwinianism, but it really just ends up being plutocracy. Because when wealthy people get in trouble, they get bailed out, and everybody else can just fend for themselves. And they've said this so many times, so it's hard to ignore these things.
Yeah, you are absolutely right, and I think this. You talked about this sort of discourse of like, you're on your own. If you got the resources, you'll be able to manage it. If you don't got it, you don't got it. And I think this brings us to a very important topic in the United States. On top of the disproportionate death rates and economic impacts that this pandemic has wrought on BIPOC communities and the poorest and most vulnerable in the United States, the 2020 uprisings are shining a light right now on the issue of structural racism in the United States. The protests against racial injustice that are going on right now are, of unprecedented scale, really. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, they seem to be, what happened, the tragedies that have occurred to them, and, the series of systemic racism that's been happening seem to be a turning point right now. What has changed after these police killings and violences, and what distinguishes this wave of protest from previous high points of anti-racist protests?
So this is something that I've spent the better part of the last few years studying. And unfortunately, my book came out like a couple months before this latest wave of Black Lives Matter protests. I wasn't able to incorporate it into the book. What I have done since is I've looked pretty closely at not just current events, but sort of studied the differences between previous waves of Black Lives Matter protests and this one, because these go back many years, right? We were talking about Ferguson in 2014, protests in Chicago over the killing of Laquan McDonald, the murder of Laquan McDonald, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Eric Garner in New York City, and many others. So what is different this time? Here's what I've been able to sort of piece together here. I'm sort of in a weird position here, to be perfectly forthright with people, because I have spent pretty much all of the last 20 years of my life at the forefront of progressive protest movements. And so really, this is the first time in the last couple months since the George Floyd killing that I haven't sort of been out there because I have underlying health conditions. So this is the first time that I haven't sort of been doing this. And so what I've been doing is I have a lot of friends within my network and colleagues who have been out there. So, this is really the first time that I've sort of been on the sidelines, but I have been able to sort of glean a lot of information from talking to these people. And based on my previous experience with Black Lives Matter protests and protests in general, I've been able to sort of compare what people have been telling me to what I've seen in the past in all of these other previous waves. And so here's what we know. What's different here? What's different is that this has been a progression over time. If you look at what people in America were saying in the early 2010s versus to the mid 2010s versus now, there's just been a really steady, intensifying support for people of color, protesters who are spotlighting police brutality and racial profiling. And it really reached sort of a fever pitch by 2020. So here's what we know in terms of some of the evidence. In 2013, only about a third of Americans, according to CBS polling, said that race relations in America could generally be seen as bad. By this year, it's twice that. It's about 61%. People are now recognizing, in other words, that things are bad. They've always been bad, but people are actually finally recognizing this now, that there's something systematic going on. And that's a big difference in less than a decade. You're talking about 7 years. Recognizing structural inequalities based on race, that is something that has started to happen much more. So in that same CBS poll, when white people, when Americans in general were asked, do white people have a better chance of getting ahead in America than people of color? Only 32% said yes. There was a sort of collective denialism in America in 2013. It's 52% in 2020. As I mentioned before, it's still a very polarized, divided nation, but now we do have a majority who are finally willing to recognize this. And this has not been something historically that Americans have been willing to do in a majority. If you look at people's thoughts about Black Lives Matter, there was some CNN polling done on this. In 2015, only about 37% of Americans said they had a favorable view of Black Lives Matter. It was not a majority support. As of this year, it's over 50%. There was a brief period at the height of the George Floyd protest. It's about 51% now, but there was a brief period where it was about 60, 65% in that range. So now we're talking about a majority of Americans to maybe upwards of 2/3, depending on the month you're looking at, who are saying they have a favorable view of these protests. So what you're seeing here, for lack of a better word, I guess, you would say this is the mainstreaming of a movement. There's been a lot of effort to sort of paint by President Trump and other conservatives and reactionaries to paint this movement as like haters of whites, as terroristic, as vigilante violent. It's important to point out 93% of these protests have been nonviolent. So it's only a very, very small number where there have been hooligans or violence or rioting or looting. So that's just a false narrative, I think. And the vast majority, most Americans seem to recognize this at this point. They understand that this is about civil rights, not about vandalism or violence. And so I think these are big changes. There's a lot to be depressed about if you're living in the United States or if you're living somewhere else looking at what's happening in the United States, but this isn't one of them. This is one of the bright spots in terms of the mainstreaming of this movement. And I really do view it as a continuation of what the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s started.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that this is, this is actually the bright thing to look at right now. And we've seen this, even the conversation that has sparked out of this has gone on a global level, not just the United States, right? We're seeing several protests across Europe, across different parts of the world, and conversations that have not been happening in so many places. So this is, I completely agree with you. This is like the bright side of this. There's so many movements. There's been so much solidarity from other movements as well in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. But I'd like actually, if you can talk to us more about the issue of, now that we know the difference, I would like to know more about the issue of systemic racism itself that we're seeing right now. Can you talk to us about what we're facing right now in terms of the systemic issues that we're seeing that are playing out in front of us? And do you think that we are assisting to a society breakdown?
Well, that's the negative side, right? I do think so. I think the United States is a country where for a long time, you could look at the ruling political class, and it's divided to a large extent. You have moderate to liberal elements of this political class, and then you have deeply reactionary ones. And the deeply reactionary part of it has been in control as compared to the sort of moderate, centrist, neoliberal part that was the Obama administration. But we've moved now into an administration here that is deeply reactionary. They're not conservative in a way like that a Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush or even a George W. Bush might have been seen as very far right conservative. This is a reactionary group of people, and they govern based upon this idea of not just neoliberalism, but active cruelty. Donald Trump, you hear in the first debate screaming law and order over and over and over. And even someone like Joe Biden, who's a relatively sort of tepid, moderate, neoliberal guy, is having to point out dog whistle racism. I mean, he's screaming these things at the top of his lungs. And this is something that, Henry Giroux has pointed out. He talks about neoliberalism as entering this stage where he refers to it as sort of neoliberal fascism, where there's this intentional cruelty that's been like baked into the cake, if you want a metaphor. This is just a fundamental part of this system where you see the most extreme manifestation of it with Trumpism, where there's this idea that if you're poor, if you're a person of color, if you're a poor person of color, if you're a veteran, if you're sick, someone who's physically sick, you're a loser. And I don't, like this whole imagery surrounding him getting sent to intensive care in the hospital and him not wanting to go because then he would look like he was sick. And then he would look weak. And then he would look like a loser. This deeply reactionary culture has meant that this president has tried to sort of project what he thinks is an image of strength. Like, I'm macho. I don't wear masks. I can deal with the coronavirus and I'm not afraid of it. And what ends up happening is you have a nation where people take that stuff seriously. It's not just theater. It's not just entertainment. And we've now fallen on our own sword because you only need so many people who don't want to wear the masks and who don't want to social distance and who don't want to take it seriously before it becomes a menace to everybody with a highly infectious virus that kills at a rate of at least 5 to 10 times, if not much more, depending on the estimates you look at, than something like a seasonal flu. This is one of the real challenges in the United States, that we have a culture that is very polarized. So I don't want to say this about everybody, but there's a segment of the United States, and it may include a third to upwards of 40% of the population, that is just deeply reactionary. They say that they think higher education is bad. This is almost 60% of Republicans say this in surveys, that it has a negative effect on the country. A third of them say openly in surveys that they're indifferent to medical research, or they have an actively negative view of it. The vast majority of Americans, even the ones who don't hate science, don't know very much about what scientists are doing, and they say as much in surveys. And something like a quarter of Americans say they think scientists are bad. Scientists are dishonest. So you have a situation here where a lot of Americans, they're sort of living in a parallel universe to the other Americans. Maybe they're getting information from Trump's Twitter feed or bogus news sources. They don't have much informational literacy in terms of being able to understand the difference between a legitimate news source and something that's conspiratorial or fabricated or made up. They have contempt for professional medical researchers. And it's actually at the point where, nobody would ever say that, oh, I have contempt for evidence, but they don't even know what a proper threshold of evidence looks like. It's a failure of education across the board in the country. And that's sort of where we're at right now, unfortunately, where the country is very polarized, and there's a subsegment of Americans, a very large number of them, who have sort of been at the forefront of this. The best sort of anecdote I guess I could give people is Rush Limbaugh. So this is not new. Rush Limbaugh has infamously said that there are 4 corners of deceit in America. And this is the most listened to radio host in America. Tens of millions of people have been exposed to this, and they support him. He says these 4 corners of deceit in America are government, media, academia, and science. think about that for a second. One of the most prominent pundits, I don't want to call him an intellectual, he doesn't rise to that level. One of the most prominent, maybe the most prominent pundit on the right says that one of the four corners of deceit in America is science. That's something that should wake people up when they hear that, because there's such a large number of Americans who fall into that type of thinking.
Wow. We would talk about, you touched a little bit on disinformation right now. We're going to talk more about that, but I actually would like to go back a little bit to Trump's first term. What do you think are Trump's greatest stains, deeds, lies, conflicts of interest, and crimes? For example, the harsh and brutal anti-immigration policies that we're seeing right now. Children are being separated from their parents. I remember during the Muslim ban, for example, I was in Washington, D.C. at that specific time. And in that same week of the Muslim ban, I'm from Sudan, one of the countries that was included. And I was at the airport at that specific week. And there was a huge amount of confusion in the airport. There were people who were being held back, who had permanent residencies. It was just extremely chaotic and just extremely brutal to see something like that. So how hard do you think it's going to be? Can you talk a little bit more about those policies, and how hard do you think it's going to be to sort of reverse the effects of these policies and the impact they're having on people?
I think it's going to be a lot harder if we have 4 more years of Donald Trump. I think that we can begin to move toward addressing these injustices if we have some kind of change in leadership. And I'm not like a gung-ho Joe Biden supporter. I don't consider myself a partisan Democrat or Republican, but at this point, pretty much anybody outside of this president would be less bad. And one thing about some of these Democratic candidates like a Joe Biden is they have shown in their policy platform that they're at least willing to think about addressing some of the issues that progressive protesters and demonstrators are raising, whether it's regarding systemic racism or climate change and the climate calamity that's looming over us. So that does not to say that Joe Biden is going to be someone that you should trust to implement those changes, but he's someone who could be pushed with popular protest, potentially. So I think that, this is something that's really important to sort of think about, because, with Donald Trump's first term, as you brought up, one thing I was very proud about was that, with the anti-Trump protests, I participated in many of these in the Lehigh Valley, where I live in Pennsylvania. And there were protests on my college campus that I was a part of against the Muslim ban in early 2017, against the repeal of DACA later in the year. And so I was very proud that people on campus were willing to stand up, whether it be faculty, staff, and students, and in the Valley in general. I think that there was a sense of a losing battle, because there was 4 years of this president that people were going to have to endure before there would even be a chance to change. And so that's where it got very depressing, where a lot of the anti-Trump protests, they really tapered off after the first year, because people understood that, you've got another 3 years of this president and he's not listening to any of the things that these people are saying, because he knows they're not going to vote for him. So I think, if you're asking me about some of the biggest stains here, number one, far and away, would be runaway climate change and pulling us out of the Paris Agreement, because this is an existential threat to humanity and to ecosystems and to species survival, runaway climate change. And so if we don't address this issue, and soon, we're talking about a major calamity here and devastation. So I think that that's a really big part of this. I think another big part of it, as you mentioned, is the immigration policy. Stealing taxpayer money, as he did, without consulting Congress to try to build his wall, having these detention facilities, which were being described in mainstream media as concentration camps, I think rightly. There was just a fundamental lack of basic sanitary conditions, people being fed expired food, denied soap and toothpaste, being crammed into cells where there were 5 times as many people as there should have been, a lack of basic medical access to care, this needlessly punitive and sadistic child-parent separation policy. Like, this is one of, this and climate change are the 2 biggest stains on this administration. And there's one other really big one too. And that's just the general significance on a symbolic level and also practically of the sort of cultural shift that this administration has been responsible for in terms of the way that we talk about issues of race and immigration, where you essentially have a president. I don't even want to say essentially, you definitely have a president here who is a closet white supremacist. He has been smuggling white nationalist, white supremacist language into his Twitter posts and into his public rhetoric for many years now. And he's mainstreamed or tried to mainstream this kind of rhetoric where it's demonizing immigrants and Muslims and people of color. And unfortunately, because there's always this effort to sort of walk it back later. He calls people in Charlottesville, these Nazis, very fine people. And then after he's condemned, he walks it back. He tells the Proud Boys, who are a neo-fascist organization, to stand by for his orders in terms of disrupting the American election. And then the next day he tries to walk it back a little bit. And so there's this weird sort of gaslighting going on with this administration where they virtue signal to these white nationalists and Nazis and planners and white supremacists, and then they walk it back later because they know that the bad PR is coming. And what they've done is they've essentially played these mind games with the nation where people have been gaslit for 4 years, where if you say in a public conversation that the president is racist and he's a white nationalist and he's a white supremacist, people take offense to it and they pretend like it's not happening. And they get offended when you say that he and his supporters are indulging in racism, when in fact, all these things are happening in the open, but it's just a sort of gaslighting where they say it and then they walk it back. And how many times can you do that before people don't take that seriously? I mean, we're at that point. We were way past that point. So this is, I think, really a huge challenge as well, that it's going to be really difficult for us to sort of heal from this and to address this, even if he is removed from office after this election.
Wow. I would actually want to go back to the point that we talked about earlier before this, which is the disinformation issue, which is a very huge issue. There was a study by Cornell University that was published a couple of days ago, and it revealed that Donald Trump would be the main factor of disinformation about COVID-19. So what is the impact of COVID-19 in the relationship to trust towards the government, trust towards the media, and what has changed due to the pandemic in terms of the public policy debates?
I think we have to be careful on the issue of trust because there's this fake rhetoric among Trump supporters who I interact with regularly and the Trump administration, where they portray themselves as anti-government and anti-media and against the establishment and against the deep state. It's very conspiratorial rhetoric. And I think what is important here is to recognize that, when I say this is faux rhetoric, it's not to be taken seriously, because they don't mean don't trust government. They don't mean don't trust the media. They mean don't trust anyone who is not a far-right individual who falls into those categories. So you should be trusting Donald Trump, of course, and the Republican Party. You should be trusting Fox News and Breitbart and Rush Limbaugh. And this has been a game that's been going on for many years and even decades on the American right, where they use the rhetoric of dissidents, but they don't actually believe in any of that, because what they really mean is that you shouldn't trust anybody who's not militantly right-wing and sort of reactionary. And so we've seen that now, routinely with the Trump administration's rhetoric, and it's gotten to the point where it's gotten, you could call this eliminationist rhetoric now, where this is actually a book written by a journalist named David Newart a number of years ago. He was way ahead of the curve on recognizing the rising sort of authoritarian culture that was permeating the United States. And a lot of it was being smuggled into mainstream media rhetoric through Fox News. And the eliminationist rhetoric was on full display last night when Donald Trump was tweeting madly between last night and yesterday during the day, talking about how Obama and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden are guilty of treason and criminals because they tried to plot a coup against him. So Biden shouldn't be allowed to even run for office, and they all need to be arrested, and Attorney General Barr needs to arrest them and pick them up. And it's gotten to the point where we're literally like sort of one person away. At this point, it's Attorney General Barr who's just sort of ignoring these things Donald Trump is saying. And that's a dangerous place to be, because you're one person removed from bringing someone in that situation who might take that rhetoric seriously and who might actually act on it. And now you're moving out of rhetorical fascism into full-on fascism. And that's basically where we're at right now. So, I think related to your point, we've got to be very careful to distinguish between the rhetoric of alleged distrust and the reality where we're moving toward a system where this administration demands blind obedience and loyalty, and they're willing to crush political dissent to get there. This is actually one of the biggest factors that drives Trump's support, by the way. So people don't like to talk about this in America, but there was actually a really good study about this done by David Smith, a sociologist, where he pointed out that authoritarian values are one of the best predictors of support for Trump. I'll read you the statements that were asked. This was part of the American National Election Study. They asked Americans if they agreed with these kinds of very authoritarian statements. And these were some of the best predictors if people agreed with these things of supporting Trump, statistically speaking. People who said that our country will be great if we honor the ways of our forefathers, do what authorities tell us to do, and get rid of the rotten apples who are ruining everything. And this is the second part of it. What our country really needs is a strong and determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. So this is straight up authoritarian fascistic rhetoric. And related to your point about distrust, it's really the opposite of that. This is demanding blind obedience. And that's where we've been headed for a number of years now with Trumpism.
Wow. This is making me reflect a lot also on being from a country that's had a dictatorship for the past 30 years. Before I was even born, there was already a president that remained until he was removed by the revolution last year. But coming from a place of authoritarianism and fascism completely, and now listening to what you're saying about what people think, how it can be if we are in an authoritarian state, it is absolutely the opposite of that, the exact opposite of that. It's none of these things that people are saying. So this is a very dangerous indication to like how people who maybe have not experienced authoritarianism, but have a different mindset of how it could be. We'll talk more about fascism, but right now I'd like to actually jump back again about the progressive movement. Can you tell us about the progressive movements, the social uprisings that developed across the United States during the Trump era specifically? And could you tell us about the evolution of those different movements? What are the characteristics and current dynamics, and how this impacts American politics? For example, the Me Too movement and so on.
Sure, sorry. This is the part where I try to walk people off the ledge of all the very scary things that we've been talking about here. And it's a shameless plug as well. I'm not beyond that. This book, which is what you're asking about, here's the good part and why I don't feel bad about the plug. It's free. This book, Rebellion in America, you can actually go online to, it's published by Routledge, but the publisher of Routledge is Taylor and Francis. And if you go to, you could even just sort of Google this or whatever. If you type in scholarship supporting the fight against racism and inequality, and I'll repeat that so people can hear it. Scholarship supporting the fight against racism and inequality. They actually have all of these resources they've made available for just these kinds of conversations where we can draw on them, where this book is free. You can go to the page, and there's a lot of other books that are free on the page as well. And they go through, they provide people resources for understanding structural racism and understanding social movements dedicated to fighting it and for fighting for social justice in general and for democracy. So my book is actually on the page. You can read it for free online. So I wanted to bring that up first before I get into the actual content of the book. But basically, to sort of give people an understanding of what I'm doing in my research is I'm laying out a modern political history of how protest and dissent and social movements have been mainstreamed again. Initially you could say that they started to be mainstreamed in the 1960s and 70s between the anti-war movement and civil rights and women's rights, environmentalism, gay and lesbian rights. And that has now continued during the 2010s, which is what this book is devoted to. So we're talking about, this is I think, good news for people who believe in the empowerment of the average person, democratic protest, rights to dissent, and the people who are unhappy with the status quo, maybe they could actually join together and be taken seriously and have some actual impact. So what the book does is it looks at social movements and their histories. He looks at the Madison protests against Governor Scott Walker in 2011 and the protests against his efforts to restrict collective bargaining and basic labor union organizing and rights. It looks at Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and the history of that. It looks at the Fight for 15 minimum wage, living wage movement of the 2010s and the history of that. It looks at Black Lives Matter during the 2010s and multiple episodes in it, including the protests in Ferguson and in Baltimore, among others. It looks at the anti-Trump protests from late 2016 onward, culminating in the rise of the Me Too hashtag and what I would also call movement. And so what it does, what I hope this book does is it gives people hope, and so that they can begin to understand that if you take a close look at these movements, there's a number of things that are going on here. Number one, once enough people get angry enough about a perceived injustice, they get so angry that they join together and they form a movement and they protest. What these people have been able to do, as I document in the book, is they have been able to get media attention, mass media attention for their causes. This is actually a very hard thing to do. I can speak firsthand about this, struggling for 20 years as part of various social movements, anti-war activism, climate activism, social justice activism with regards to anti-racism, and so on and so on. It's a hard thing to do, but if enough people get together in mass, it becomes impossible for the media to ignore the movement itself, and whatever their main goals are, they usually are able to break through with these. So I actually document in the book how the media coverage eventually responds to these movements as they arise and as they rise up, and how what happens is that you start seeing rising public support for these movements in surveys. And that is a direct function of the fact that people are seeing these movements in the media, and the people who are consuming this media coverage become more supportive than people who aren't, because they're being exposed to the messages. And then what ends up happening is you get a critical mass where we're at this point now. We're not past this point because we don't have the Trump administration is still in power, right? And they're not listening to these progressive movements. But we are at the point where if he was removed, there would be a potential for change. The Democratic Party now has responded to Fight for 15 by officially adopting a $15 an hour minimum wage as their formal policy. We're hearing the Democratic presidential candidate talking about things like community policing and getting people together in a room to talk about structural racism. And these are things where the Bernie Sanders campaign really helped, drawing on these movements that I've been mentioning, to push the Democratic Party to address issues like climate change with the Green New Deal. And even if Joe Biden's not in favor of that, he is in favor of talking about taking action, and maybe he could be pressured to do that. We're hearing about a lot of things that we wouldn't hear about under a second Trump administration. And I think one of the big lessons that comes out of this book is that we have now gotten to a point where American political systems have become so dysfunctional between Congress, the courts, and the president, that we are now at a point where these social movements are the primary venue and mechanism through which democratic change is going to be achieved. They are going to be the ones that have to lead the way in terms of cultivating mass support, which will then have to pressure these political systems at some point to respond. So we don't know exactly how this is all going to end right now, because we're still living through this process. But there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that these movements over the last 10 years have been laying the groundwork for some positive change, and hopefully in the near future.
Thank you, and thank you for actually mentioning the point about hope. That's very, I think it's so easy to lose sight of hope amid all the negativity and the things that are happening. So yeah, hope is there. It's there, and we work together and we can get there. Actually, we'd like to actually take a 5-minute pause right now. So we will take a pause for 5 minutes and then we will resume again. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I would like to actually remind everyone again that there will be a question and answer session right after this. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to write your questions down and we will get at them. We do have one last question for you, Anthony, and then we would switch to the Q&A session right after that. So I would like to ask you as a final question, could you explain to us what constitutes Trump's base? What attracts right-wing populism? You know, what are their demands? What concerns play a role in mobilizing Trump support?
I think this is a really important question that is addressed in the book Rebellion in America, if people want to check it out. I've done, or what I've tried to do in the book is have the most comprehensive review, at least that I've been able to find, of not only the other studies that have been done, but looking at my own analysis of the national survey data on why people say they like Donald Trump and what kinds of beliefs and demographics are associated with Trumpism, because there's been a lot of misinformation about this. American journalists and a fair number of academics have portrayed this as poor or financially insecure white working class Americans who are angry about globalization and neoliberalism, and they're rising up. And really, this is very little truth in this. I've looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of financial and economic metrics in survey data of people who say that they're Trump supporters. And there's virtually no evidence to suggest that they're actually more financially insecure compared to, yes.
Sorry, I just want to say 1 second. Can we go a little bit slower? I think some of the audience are asking to go a little slower.
Sure.
Sorry to cut you off.
No problem. Sorry. So the simple point is that there's virtually no evidence that economic insecurity is driving Trump support. What seems to be the case when you look at these surveys is that issue after issue after issue, it's what I would call social, cultural, reactionary beliefs that are most often the best predictors of whether someone's likely to support Trump. And so what I mean by that is people who say that America needs fewer immigrants, that it's becoming too racially and ethnically diverse, that we want to limit the number of Muslims coming into the country, that they represent a threat, that we don't want refugees from the Middle East coming to the United States. Some other stuff, pro-life politics, unrestricted gun rights. These are also really, really strong predictors of Trump support. But basically what you see over and over and over is that these are the same old sort of usual suspects of Republican politics who for a number of years now have been driven by sociocultural reactionary politics, and they have a very clear agenda. They don't like that the United States is becoming more diverse ethnically, racially, because of immigration. They want to cut down as much of it as possible. And they want to take people of color and immigrants and people who are not white conservatives and just white people in general. They want these people to be permanently of a minority status and subordinated. And because that's not what the predictions are saying demographically where this country is going. They say that, you know, by 2040s to 2050s, we will be a majority minority country. And so these people have very much responded to this part of Donald Trump's message. And so this is the primary thing that's driving Trumpism. That's important to point out because there has been so much misinformation and mischaracterizations of what this is.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for clearing that up a little bit. And I also just want to remind everyone again that the link for Anthony's book, Rebellion in America, has been dropped in the chat. If you're for folks who are in the Zoom chat, it's been dropped there, the one from Taylor and Francis that you had mentioned. So I personally look forward to reading this book very much. So right now we've actually reached our question and answer session. So I would be taking some of the questions that have come from the audience. And I will start with the first question that we got here. So the question says, shortly after Trump's election, there were major women's protest marches, including here in Montreal. What about this mobilization today? And can it play a role in the electoral outcome?
I think it's an interesting question because the question here is how to link social protest with actual tangible political and electoral change. It's a hard question to answer because, I haven't seen any data that suggests like people would say in a survey that because people went out and protested, that makes me more likely to go vote and vote against Donald Trump. So the way that I would try to frame this is, and I usually do this with social movements, I try to portray it within the broader picture of a larger conversation where I say these protests, they're part of a larger anti-Trump movement, and they're the very visible public face of it that has been a part of a process where people over the last 4 years have been increasingly mobilized, galvanized. In other words, it's drawing attention to the injustices associated with this administration. So it's part of a larger national conversation and movement. And so if we frame it in those very general terms, then I think it does make sense to talk about these protests as being effective. We know from looking at the survey data of people who attend anti-Trump protests that they tend to be very, very liberal, progressive, left, democratic. But, we also know that it's not just that group that they've spoken to, that, they have been part of driving a national conversation that has also appealed to many people who are ideologically moderate or centrist or independent in their party leanings, who have also been hearing these conversations, and they've been a part of this conversation that's been mobilizing against Trump. So I think in those very general terms, it makes a lot of sense to talk about the anti-Trump protests as an important part of this effort to resist.
Thank you, Anthony. I have another question. And so this question says, Trump is not alone in this world today when it comes to be in power in a country. There is Modi in India, Duterte, Erdogan, Bolsonaro from the global south, and then the neoliberal right-wing rulers in Europe. Do you see it as a global phenomenon, like the global fascism of the 1930s?
The simple answer would be yes. We could add Boris Johnson, right? And Nigel Farage in the UK and Brexit, which was largely driven by immigration animosity as well. That's what the research has suggested that I've seen, looking at people in the UK who were in favor of Brexit. They were mainly driven by immigration issues, not economics. We could look at Marine Le Pen in France, right? And so I guess my simple answer would be yes, but I would add a qualification. I would say this is a global phenomenon, but the United States is one of the worst in terms of this, because you could say, at least in other countries like France, Marine Le Pen was defeated before she had a chance to take power. And in the United States, Donald Trump has had sort of unfettered access to and control over the political system, him and the Republican Party, for the last 4 years. So the United States is particularly one of the worst cases, not the only bad case, but one of the worst.
Okay, and we have a third question here that says, sorry, I'm just reading the questions from my phone. It says, can the Democratic Party change in depth? Can we hope that the Bernie campaign will mutate into something bigger and better? And apparently, DSA supporters have made gains mostly at state levels as Democratic candidates. Is that indicative of a trend?
I think potentially. I think we should distinguish between party platforms and actual action, because we know in terms of a party platform and the rhetoric of these neoliberal Democrats, that part has changed. Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton started adopting the language of student debt relief, right? started talking about action on climate change. Hillary Clinton rolled back her rhetorical and practical support for free trade agreements. We know that Bernie Sanders has been successful in trying to get the Democratic Party to embrace, as part of its platform, a $15 an hour minimum wage. We see these candidates like Andrew Yang, who has had some success in, as a pretty liberal guy, mainstreaming, or at least partly mainstreaming, universal basic income in the United States. And so, you know, I don't think it's impossible for the Democratic Party to shift. We have seen it in the past with the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, through the Johnson administration with Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. You had the New Deal, you had the Great Society, the war on poverty. So it is clearly the case that there are historical examples where the Democratic Party has been forced with enough pressure from below, whether it be the civil rights movement in the 1960s or the labor movement in the 1930s, to make a change. So there's nothing here that says it's impossible, but it is going to be difficult because we're not there yet. From what we saw with the Democratic primaries, right, and the delegate counts, Bernie Sanders never really got further than about a third of them. So, you know, what happened was there were all these Democratic candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who they all decided they would sort of join forces, and almost all of them would drop out and they would just go to Biden, right? And that was like 2/3 of the delegate count. So there, in other words, what that tells you is that there's still a solid part of this party that is very centrist, neoliberal. But at least what this tells us now is that it's a fight. You now have this Bernie Sanders wing, which is responding to these social movements. And by the way, Bernie was very explicit about that, drawing on Fight for 15 very explicitly in his language when he was, before he ran for president and during, both times, and also talking about Occupy Wall Street and the Madison protests. So we have a civil war within the Democratic Party. I don't really like using war references, so maybe there's a better way to frame that. There's definitely a struggle. There's definitely a conflict, and where it goes from now, I think, is going to be dependent to a large extent on how much more activism there is and how much pressure is exerted on the Democratic Party. Because unfortunately, you know, I considered myself a supporter of Green Party candidates for many years, even decades. But the way that the U.S. electoral process is set up, the rules of the game systematically cut against third parties. And so the Green Party has been trying now for decades to break into mainstream discourse and power, and they've really failed because the system is set up to cut out third parties. So now we're sort of at a point where these third party people like Bernie Sanders, who was never a Democrat, he was always an independent, realizes he has to run as a Democrat to have a chance to impact the political process. So that's sort of where we're at right now. I don't consider myself a party guy or much of an elections guy, although I recognize that parties are important and elections are important. I've always really been more about this idea of what's happening in the streets and with protest. And then, you know, at the end of that process of people mobilizing, these parties have to respond. So I would put most of my emphasis on the movement stuff, 80 to 90%, and then the party politics and elections is the other 10 to 20%. That's how I look at it, at least.
Thank you. That's very insightful. And thank you so much again to everyone who's dropping questions. Very, very useful questions here that we all can learn from. We have another question, and it says, it's concerning to see Obama and Biden addressing the erosion of democracy and the rise of fascism by Trump administration in the past 4 years. What does the next 4 years look like for democracy in the US and worldwide? If right-wing populism delves into fascism, if Trump stays in power?
I don't believe that Donald Trump has a chance to stay in power fairly at this point with a 10-point deficit. I believe that if he does stay in power, it will be because of massive voter suppression through relying on neo-fascistic militia type people to suppress the vote, by finagling states to give, or the Supreme Court to give him states and all of their electoral votes so he could basically essentially steal an election. I think if that happens, if he wins through something that's even worse than dirty tricks, this is just full-on authoritarianism, the only hope from that point forward is a national strike, where people have to say, good freedom-loving, democratic-loving people who support the rule of law and don't want to live in a dictatorship have to come out and say, this is it. If there was ever a moment to rise up and have a national strike, this is it. And that people aren't going to stop until he leaves. So that may be the last and best hope if he does manage to finagle his way into some technical victory that he claims, or he won't leave office, let's say, right? And he does lose. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but I'm a realist. And so I think it is going to happen, that he is going to refuse to leave. And at that point, if he refuses to leave, people are going to have to push for him to leave. If he lost this election fair and square, which he seems to be what's going to be happening at this point, looking at the polling.
This actually relates a little bit to this this question that we have next. Do you think that an actual civil war could occur in the US if Trump wins November 3rd, or if he doesn't but refuses to leave office?
It's very possible. I just saw a news story about how there were these militia fascistic style people in Michigan who had a plot to kidnap the governor. And the FBI came out and said that they were intercepted this plot. And so these things are happening. And I think the real danger in the United States is not that there are these massive militias that could rise up and overpower the military or the police. I think the real danger is that you have a large number of police in America, not all, of course, but a large number of them who are very, not just conservative, but maybe even right-wing themselves, who turn a blind eye to these militia-style people who are running around the streets, like, for example, Kyle Rittenhouse in Wisconsin, who shot someone in the back and then claimed it was self-defense, who thought he was doing the work of the police, and the police were patting him on the back, essentially, giving him water, letting him walk through with an AR-15. And so the real danger in the United States is not necessarily that Donald Trump is going to order the military to go into cities and put people down who protest, although he tried to do that. And the military told him no, to their credit. They said, get lost, basically. We're not going to intervene and put down largely peaceful protesters for your ego and for your power. So that's not what's going to happen in the United States. I think the real danger is that he is going to keep using these venues like Twitter to have all types of veiled references that people need to do something, like he said last night, and take things into their own hands. And there are enough people out there who are very far right-wing, reactionary, neo-fascistic, that even if, this is what we're talking about, 10% of Americans say it's okay to be a Nazi. They say that in surveys when they've been asked. And so, 20% of Trump supporters say it's okay to use violence to get what you want against civilians for political purposes. Even if 90 out of 100 of these people are full of it, if you have 10 out of 100 who are willing to take a gun and an AR-15 into the streets to shoot people, you could have a massive amount of havoc and violence that could degenerate into more and more of this sort of tribalistic military style conflict. And I think that's the real danger, that there are individual people who the US refers to whenever these mass shootings happen as lone wolves. And then they find out later that they weren't really lone wolves. They were part of these chat rooms that had been stoking extremism and these websites that had been stoking extremism. And these people go out and they take things into their own hands. And what this allows someone like Trump to do is he can claim that he didn't support it and he didn't call on it because he's very veiled and generic in his language. Like when he says to the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. But then the real risk is that these people listen to that and then they go into the streets. And even if it's a small number of people, they can create an incredible amount of havoc and destruction and violence with mass shootings. So that's the real danger when we talk about fascistic threats to the rule of law. And if police aren't cracking down on this stuff and they're not taking it seriously enough, and they're playing into this rhetoric about how, oh, well, Black Lives Matter people are vigilantes who had it coming to them because they were lawless, then there's a lot of potential there for danger.
Thank you, Anthony. We have two last questions, but one of them has actually been answered about the White House, about Trump leaving the White House if he loses. But a part of it, I will say it, and I will say the other question. Someone is asking, do you think that Trump is really sick with COVID-19? Do we have proof of that? And the other question is actually about the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Someone's asking, what is the impact of the death of RBG and her future replacement in the campaign?
To make it as quick as I can with the Supreme Court one, since you have two questions you posed, it is an incredibly important thing. You're talking about another judge on the court who looks like there's a nomination that's attempted to be rushed through here. And it's going to have profound implications, not just for the ways in which Americans talk about politics in the court in a very lame way, where they just want to talk about abortion. I mean, that part is incredibly important, but there's so much more to it. You know, you're talking about a solidly conservative to reactionary Supreme Court if she gets appointed. This new appointment where it's going to mean like the intensification of corporate power, further assault on American labor, what little is left of it, the social reactionary agenda. So it's going to be very important on a lot of different levels. I don't know whether the Democratic Party can sort of stop that at this point, because the Republicans, if some of these people who recover from COVID, a number of these senators, if they do end up voting virtually like they're talking about, there may not be much the Democratic Party can do. But we'll see. It's hard for me to predict for sure, but it doesn't look good for people who are critical of the rise of the conservative court. In terms of Donald Trump and COVID, I have very little doubt that he has been very sick. When we saw him walk up the stairs for his attempted photo op at the White House, and then he walked in and then he walked back out so they could see him again because they didn't get the proper shot, you could see in the pictures him wincing and gasping for breath. He's one who loves to project confidence and strength, so he's not going to be doing that otherwise. And one thing we know about the Trump administration is that they have about as many leaks as the Titanic. This is an administration full of backbiting snakes and people who stab each other in the back, and they can't wait to go to the media and leak all types of bad information and air the dirty laundry. And this is how we always know with this administration how dysfunctional it is. Because, you know, you get this information that comes out that Donald Trump had to be put on an experimental antibody that's being given to nobody because he was that bad. And they had to give him oxygen because he couldn't breathe. And they had to put him on steroids and a vitamin D regimen and other drugs as well. And so, you know, Donald Trump did not want to go to the hospital. He militantly, from the reports we saw, opposed that because he thought it would make him look weak and it would make him look stupid because he'd been playing down coronavirus this whole time. And, you know, to the extent that this had an impact for him, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, he did lose a couple of points. He went from like 7 or 8 points down to 10 points. So this was an embarrassment for him. And I don't think that he wanted any of those things to happen because they run contrary to his whole persona, which is that sick people are weak and losers. So I have no doubt that he has been sick, and we'll see what happens. You know, Herman Cain was COVID positive, and he said he was getting better for an entire month before he passed away. So Donald Trump is not out of the woods here as someone who's in his 70s with a number of comorbidities that go along with coronavirus and that are a risk to his life.
So this actually brings us to the end of this webinar today. Thank you so much, Anthony, for this truly insightful information and conversation today. And thank you so much, everyone who was watching us tonight. This is the first of 4 webinars, so I invite you to participate in the other ones as well. The next one is going to be on October 17th, addressing the confrontation between the United States and China. Then there's one on October 22nd to talk about why does the right wing attract the working class. And the last seminar will be on November 14th. So it will be after the results are out. And we're sort of going to look at the way forward for progressive movements on the left. You'll find more information on the pages of alternatives and the partners of this talk today. And also, please check out Anthony DiMaggio's new piece on Counterpunch. It is going to be published tomorrow. And once again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Have a lovely night.
Thank you for having me.